Wait till then when to set it. Make the link live.
I think they're handling it. They're handling it. So, is this gonna work? That works. Try it again. It worked. Oh.
Okay, yeah, good.
Nice. Just close this and. Should be good. And then this jump drive we can remove. Or just leave it?
Just leave it for now. I was just about to confirm that.
It only works as a...
No. Yes.
It's a little bit finicky. I'm happy to help.
You know what you're doing.
Yeah, no, that's okay. Go here.
It was advancing, so that's good.
Yeah. There we go. All right. Perfect. Thank you so much.
So for the Q&A, they're not in here. They can't be heard. Turn them on, you just hold them down.
Okay. Should we start? Do you want to get people to take a seat? Steer. Are you okay? You look concerned. No, I just don't want to knock this setup off. Perfect. Do you want to? You're going to stand right here. Okay, we're going to. Let's go ahead and get started. If you're conferring in the hallway, we'd love to see you in here. Encourage you to come in and take a seat. So my name is Julia Haggerty. I'm a faculty member at Montana State University, which is another proud land-grant institution located a short 2,500 kilometers away from here. And I'm really grateful to be a member of the steering committee for this research coordination network on global coal transitions, and honored to introduce today's keynote and help moderate this session. Joining me this afternoon, will you stand up, is Dr. Daniel Ramey, who is a fellow at Resources for the Future and a lecturer at the Gerald Ford School of Public Policy at the University of Michigan. So what I'd like to do is welcome everybody and people online to today's keynote address here at the 2024 Conference on Global Coal Transitions at Ohio State. This conference is a convening of researchers from around the world and a variety of disciplines. Her concern with the impacts of coal transitions and responding to those impacts with creative and meaningful research. We're supported by the National Science Foundation and the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. And this is the sort of central convening of a 3-year project, which also includes some smaller side trips to Europe last year and to Australia next year. So for our international guests, we're really fortunate to be able to introduce you to some of the, 2 of the really key leaders in the coal transition space in the United States. That's Heidi Binko, who's the co-founder and CEO of the Just Transition Fund, and Dr. Brian Anderson, who represents the Department of Energy and the Interagency Working Group on Coal and Power Plant Communities and Economic Diversification. Revitalization. I'd never get through that one. So these 2 represent 2 really fundamental pillars in our national approach to resourcing a just transition in the United States. One is a philanthropic perspective, deeply informed by a long history of community and regional organizing, and the other is an effort to really help the federal government rise to the occasion of addressing the needs of coal-impacted communities. So we've asked, and they've generously agreed, that Brian and Heidi share the stage today so our audience can really get a sense of the range of approaches and strategies that are at play in the United States context. So our format today is the following. Heidi Binko will speak first, and she'll be followed by Brian Anderson. And what I'll do is provide a detailed biography of each speaker before they speak. And when they're finished, they'll come up to the stage together, and we'll moderate a Q&A. And we've got a nice long session, so dig in and bring all your questions you have about this really interesting case in the United States. So thanks for being patient. Now I'm proud to introduce and excited to introduce Heidi Binko, as I said, co-founder and chief executive officer of the Just Transition Fund. Heidi is a trailblazing leader and visionary in energy transition and climate philanthropy. With more than 2 decades of experience addressing climate, coal, and energy issues, Heidi has dedicated her career to championing economic resilience and sustainable development in coal-impacted communities across the U.S., and as a subject matter expert around the world. Heidi and her team have become a beacon of innovation and hope for communities hardest hit by the energy transition, notably rural and tribal places. Under her leadership, the Just Transition Fund has pioneered a national model for equitable implementation of federal funds by helping disadvantaged communities overcome barriers to successfully accessing federal investments in locally led projects. Today, many organizations at the national and state level have replicated this approach and regularly seek JTF's guidance and leadership. Prior to co-founding the Just Transition Fund, Heidi served as the executive director of the West Wind Foundation and associate director for special climate initiatives at the Rockefeller Family Fund, where she played a pivotal role in the development and expansion of what we know as IEFA, or the Institute of Energy Economics and Financial Analysis. Her influence extends beyond organizational leadership. She's held positions as co-chair of the Climate and Energy Group of the Appalachia Funders Network, the board of directors of the Environmental Grantmakers Association, and of the Climate and Energy Funders Group, a project of the Biodiversity Funders Group. Her academic credentials include degrees from Yale University and the University of Notre Dame. And in recognition of her groundbreaking work and unwavering commitment to climate action, in 2023, Heidi was honored as one of Google's 6 most influential women in climate change. Her passion, expertise, and leadership continue to inspire and drive transformative and economic change in the energy transition. So after that, we are so grateful to have you here, Heidi. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Julia. It's such an honor to be with you all here, and that's the first time actually that bio has been read out loud, so it was exciting. So thank you all. Yes, I am here to talk with you today about the work in the just transition space that I've seen over the course of more than 10 years now, almost 15 years to be truth be told, over 3 different administrations. So we're calling this presentation the Just Transition Fund in 3 Acts, and I'd love to just give you a little sense about what the work looks like under different administrations, the different entry points that you as young scholars can really come to the work with. And I think also there'll be some common themes that we'll sift through that will make it apparent to all of us, that will really highlight lessons learned about how we make this work stick and how we do it in a way where we can effectively navigate changing political winds, because it can be done, right? So with that, and Julia, sorry, what do I press to advance? Is it that? Okay, I got that. Okay, great. Okay, so first up, just a little bit more. I mean, Julia was kind enough and introduced me. I want to just tell you a little bit more about myself. As Julia mentioned, I've been in climate and energy philanthropy for about more than 20 years now, and throughout those 20 years, I've worked with coal communities all around our country and in Australia. And everywhere I went, I was always being asked the question of local folks, Heidi, I don't know what we're going to do when the coal plant or the coal mine closes, because our local economy really runs on coal, right? And so that was just an issue and a question that really, really stuck with me. It particularly stuck with me because this issue, as I think some of you know, is really deeply personal to me. My aunt was an IBEW worker and worked at the coal plant where I grew up for 40 years. My mom worked in that local school district, and when that plant closed, it took away 40% of the local government's budget revenue. So that was really tough. I think for me, what really flipped the switch, though, was the day, probably about 15 years ago now, maybe 14 years, where an environmental group came to my town and said, shut that coal plant down. And that was really, really tough, because I'm with them on a climate perspective. I'm with them from a health perspective, cone of death, right? The closer you live to a coal plant in the United States, the higher your risk of cancer, right? So I'm with them on those areas, but boy, when you start to think about the jobs and the people and my family and my family's friends that were affected, it's really, really, really different, right? So for me, that is really what catalyzed all of this work. I started working on economic transition issues in around 2010, 2011 at my job at the Rockefeller Family Fund. And what I started to see was that, again, even though philanthropy was spending a lot of time and attention closing things, they weren't necessarily spending time thinking about how to make the economies really vibrant in these places, right? So what we were seeing at the time, and again, many of you know this, so I won't dwell on this too much, but this is the economic problem that we were facing, right? And when you think about it, it really is stacks of financial distress, right? Or distress. You see the direct job loss that happens when plants and mines close. We all know that for every direct coal plant worker that loses their job, we lose 3 to 4 more jobs in the community. So you see that indirect job loss. And then the real big impact of these closures is really the erosion of the tax base. Severance tax you lose when mines close, property tax you lose when coal plants close. And in the case of out west, communities that mine federal coal, they are dependent on state and federal royalties, right? So in some places, some communities can have to deal with all of these, right? So it's a really, really significant problem. So that's what I was seeing. I wasn't seeing anyone doing really anything about it until we started organizing, probably circa 2012, 2013 at this point. At the Rockefeller Family Fund, we were starting to make some investment in some of these communities. I was actually starting to think about how do you bring together coal plant and coal mine communities and what can they learn from each other, right? To me, this is an energy system, and so it was natural that you should bring 2 sides together to think about how you move forward, right? But it was really in 2015 when the Obama administration introduced their new power program, which, again, as most of you probably know, it was the first time that federal funds were ever made available to help coal communities. That is what really catalyzed the start of the JTF, and so that's when we really decided to launch the fund. And if we can think about the Obama administration, let's think about this as the first act of the JTF. So we started in 2015, in April 2015. The idea was to work around the country in places where coal plants or coal mines had closed. And again, we all know, at least in the US, if funding is set aside for things and it's not used, it can very easily be repurposed or it goes away. So my goal as a philanthropist at that time was to think about how can we get these federal resources into the hands of communities that really, really, really need it, right? And as we were thinking about climate change, right, our comments to climate philanthropy and to those that were working on the issue was one in which we were saying, look, unless you really think about the communities that are on the front lines of these changes, and unless they can really realize a vibrant economic future for their family, it makes all the sense in the world that they would remain dependent and want to remain dependent on a fossil fuel economy. So we need to change that conversation and change that narrative. And that's what we did. So we started the JTF with the Rockefeller Family Fund and the Appalachian Funders Network as a co-venture. We launched in 2015, and our goal was very specifically to strengthen and diversify the economies of hard-hit coal communities from the bottom up, right? All right. So I think many people don't realize this, but one of the very first things that we did at the JTF is I wanted to make sure that we had a way to know who exactly was impacted and how big is the problem, right? So we undertook a data-driven analysis that's rooted in equity that we repeat every couple years to make sure that we've got updated stats. And we realized that as of 2016, like starting in 2016, there are 372 counties that have either coal plant or coal mine closures or both, right? So we brought in a team of data scientists. We worked for a very long time, and we looked at a range of both economic and demographic factors to actually rank those 372 counties. And that's where we go first, right? So it affects 10% of the counties in the United States, which, one wouldn't think that the problem is that big, but it is. You can also think of that 10% figure as being conservative, because the communities that we highlight, the counties that we highlight, are literally just the counties with infrastructure, and we know that people drive for work, right? If you further dig down into the problem and you say, who are we serving and who's really affected, you very quickly realize that the hardest hit coal communities in the United States are rural. And that makes a ton of sense, right? Because often when an industry or a big entity might be the only game in town, when they close, it's going to have an oversized ripple effect. It's a lot easier in urban areas, right? So again, we wanted to target our work in the places that were experienced the most significant economic distress and had the highest populations of marginalized people. In a sense, what that meant is we went where the problem is the worst and the capacity is the least. And this is what the communities look like. They are rural, they are tribal communities in this country, and they are also environmental justice communities, right? Okay, so just to continue and just say a little bit more about our work in those early years. So this is, circa Obama, so 2015, 2016. A big focus of our work, and the reason we started the fund in the first place was to help communities access those power funds. At the time, it was a really modest budget. We used about 1.4, maybe slightly less, in grants that helped leverage about $19 million in federal funds. The funding for power was really targeted and focused within the Appalachian Regional Commission and the Economic Development Administration, so we worked with them. And during that time, we also started to do a bunch of technical assistance, right? Because we were seeing that communities, particularly that had power plant closures, were really struggling with how to get started, right? So at that time, it was a lot of technical assistance and a lot of critical capacity building to get those leaders up and running. And I put this slide in because I wanted to emphasize, when I think about sort of that first act and what we learned from those first early years, it really quickly became apparent to us, and this is actually the framework that we have used ever since, that we needed what we call a just transition framework to do this work. This is our three-legged stool. In every place that we work, we think about investments in terms of the economic diversification investments that we make investments in workforce development, and we make investments in infrastructure, right? We spend a lot of time thinking about broadband at the JTF because a lot of the coal communities in this country are not not connected and don't have adequate connectivity. And companies do not go where there's no broadband access. And if you don't have broadband access, it's a fundamental impediment to economic development nonstop. So that's our three-legged stool. And I think that was really one of the big lessons that came out for us in those early days. So now, fast forward a little bit. President Trump comes into office, and now we have a whole different way of thinking about these issues. So we're looking across the field, right? We're saying, okay, there's a lot of needs still here. There is still money available at the federal level, but the interesting thing about it is that even though places like ARC and EDA retained the civil servants that had worked there for years, the decision-making structures were changing, right? Instead of a lot of decisions being made in Washington, they were made at the state. And so the type of investments that we were seeing with power funds under Obama were radically different, even though they still remained in play under Trump. And so the bottom line for us at that point was really us realizing we're not going to make as much headway, and this whole movement is just getting started. What can we do to keep this work going, right? So we pivoted under the Trump administration. And, as I think about what were the pillars of our work during those years, it was capacity building, it was technical assistance, it was curating best practices for communities on our Blueprint for Coal Communities page that we have on our website that really helped communities figure out how to get started and do this work. And it was policy development. And it's the policy development story that I'd really like to tell to you about today. So we're out there doing this work during the Trump administration, and we are working in Appalachia, we're working in southern Illinois, we're working in the Powder River Basin, we're working with the Navajos and the Hopis. And you can say that these communities are very, very different, and you would not be wrong. But what we were seeing at the JTF is that there are a number of high-level commonalities that unite them. And so what we did is we initiated a project that we called our National Economic Transition Initiative to bring all those labor, workforce, and economic development leaders together to articulate what was needed in a national ambitious federal coal transition program. So instead of having Appalachians saying we need this, Navajo saying, and tribes saying we need this, we wanted to bring everybody together to start at that very high fundamental level. So that was the idea behind our NET initiative, to really bring folks together, to use Obama's Power Initiative as a start, right? Because it worked, but we needed something better, we needed something stronger. So we were thinking Power Plus, but on steroids, right? So that's what we did. So we pulled together a team of 18 leading community organizations from around the country. A couple of them have been presenting here today. And we worked over a period of almost 2 years, and we held facilitated meetings all around the country. We brought in over 300 different organizations for those local leaders to really give feedback to the federal government on what is needed, what is needed to do this work and to accelerate this work. And you can see from the slide up here the great planning team members that we had. We had folks like Appalachian Voices who spoke this morning. The ACLC worked with us, the Blue Green Alliance, Coalfield Development, Generation West Virginia, AFL-CIO, Kentuckians for the Commonwealth. We had a lot of folks that were doing this really good groundbreaking work at the local level. And I think that was really the power here, right? We really wanted to make sure that local people were informing policy. And so this was the platform that we released with 85 signatories of organizations in June 2020, and there were 7 pillars. And I don't have the website up, but happy to send it around to anyone who'd like to learn more. Essentially, you'll see the JTF framework in here with a focus on restorative economic development, workforce development, and infrastructure, a critical piece here. And you'll also see the importance of local leadership and coordination and access, right? These were the pillars that everyone working on these issues all across the country said, this is what we need if we're really going to do this work and transition in a way that is equitable. So fast forward now, because we're now getting into what I would call Act 3, which kind of brings us full circle back to the federal access work. So the platform was released in 2020, and it was immediately picked up by a lot of different channels. We had I remember the The White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council drew on the NET platform for its recommendations when they were creating the Justice 40 initiative. We had an amendment in Congress passed that lauded it by Senator Duckworth. And we even got a call we actually started to get a few calls from the Biden administration about our findings, what we were seeing that we needed, and, could we advise them as they start thinking about what, the creation of some type of interagency working group. So, long story short, when I look back on the amazing group of local organizations and local and regional leaders that really put their, blood, sweat, and tears into this platform, it's had huge implications, right? And, a lot of this work has been work that has been built on for years. But effectively, the ideas that were in that platform, we saw as part of the American Rescue Plan, right? That led the creation of the 552 EDA Coal Commitment Challenge. We saw the bipartisan law pick up a lot of the different things that we were asking for, including funding for broadband expansion, and as Eric was talking about earlier, the $11 billion to clean up abandoned mine lands. We saw the CHIPS and Science Act come with $1 billion for the Recompete program, which in our minds is actually one of the most exciting programs out there, because it allows these communities to work on comprehensive economic development in a way that is not sector specific, right? And then of course, it doesn't need to be said, the Inflation Reduction Act, which provides for, just stacks of tax credits, grants, and loans to these communities. So we entered into the Biden administration very early on with literally hundreds of billions of dollars available for these energy communities. But guess what? As we know, here's our new problem, right? These communities are rural, they're under-resourced. It is exceedingly difficult for low-capacity communities to access these federal funds. You have to, if you're trying to access funding for rural economic development in the United States, you have to navigate over 400 programs that are spread across over 10 different agencies, right? They all have different requirements. And, thank you, Brian Anderson and the IWG. They're doing a wonderful job to help make some of this a lot easier for people to navigate. But there are still tough requirements there, right? Like 50% cost there, right? So again, we saw, this is great, historic opportunity, as somebody said this morning, but what does it mean if the funding actually can't flow to the communities that need it the most, right? So it was during this period that we really, at the JTF, we really, I would say, found our groove and really sort of figured out what we were good at and what the work was going to look like in the Biden administration. And it really brought us back full circle to this work to help communities access federal funds. So I'm going to speak a little bit to that. We have our Federal Access Center, which we, again, started in 2015, but really formalized in January of 2020, at the end of the month. And at our Federal Access Center, we help communities that are ready to go and ready to get grants from a variety of different agencies. We also, through our Coal Communities Get Ready Challenge, help those communities that need to come into the pipeline, right? And I think this is one of the really important lessons from philanthropy that we've learned and that I'd love to talk about. This work doesn't happen overnight. So you see all these great Build Back Better award winners, we even hopefully keeping our fingers crossed, Reclaim, all the big awards that are coming down. It takes years of investing in these groups to help them test their approaches, figure out what works and what doesn't, build their capacity to access federal funds, and learn how to do that, and then scale, right? We saw some great successes because we were ready and we got started early, right? And so that's why, in my opinion, this building of this funnel, of this pipeline, is really, really, really critical. So that's the second piece of our Federal Access Center. And the third piece is the really exciting work that we're doing with federal agencies. And I think I'm perhaps most excited. We recently created a partnership with the Office of Indian Energy Policy at the Department of Energy, and we're working really closely with the DOE as they have signed an MOU with the Navajo and the Hopi government. We're working on the ground with our Indigenous grant writers to help those communities both design and access federal funds and imagine what's possible in their communities. So just a few thoughts that I'd love to leave you with, again, that, again, this stuff doesn't happen overnight, but over the course of the history of the JTF, we've seen a lot of really exciting wins. $63 million to the Build Back Better Coalition in West Virginia, $500 million to help create a green bank for rural America. 5 of our JTF grantees are finalists for pending recompete grants. And then also we have a couple of NSF Engine Grant Award recipients. And then finally, I think one of the things I'm also really, really proud of is the work that we did with some of our foundation partners to keep the doors open at the United Mine Workers Career Center in southwestern Pennsylvania. So we moved really, really quickly to give them the capacity that they need. So overall, JTF today: access, advocate, convene. I've talked about the access, right? The advocacy work that we do today is really focused on the state level. And I think bottom line, what I would love for you to take away is that what we have always really tried to do at the JTF is make sure that local economic and workforce development leaders, right, the people that these policies are really intended to support, are the ones that are informing state and federal policy. We don't have a government set up that makes it easy to bring in communities. So to the extent that we can resource, bring the right people to the table, that's what we do. And these are just a couple of our policy wins over the past couple of years. What we've really been trying to do is accelerate the adoption of state transition funds and, to a lesser extent, matching funds, because that's another, I think, really key lesson here. And we see this in the German transition and in other places around the world. The importance of integrating local, state, federal and philanthropic resources is absolutely critical. No one can do this on their own. And so it's really key in all these places to figure out what are the opportunities available, and then what is the system of coordination for accessing these resources. And then the final piece of our work today is our convening. And if you have not heard of it, if you have not received an invitation, please talk with me or my colleague Camille. Every year in October, we bring all of our grantees together. We usually have a really strong showing from labor, the private sector, and absolutely the federal government and federal agencies. But we bring people together to share best practices so that people can really replicate what they're seeing in other places. And, I was really struck a couple of years ago, one of our grantees who runs a native CDFI, she said to me, she said, the best gift that I could be given is something that works in another place so that I don't have to try something myself, right? So at the JTF, our approach is really on those model programs, right? What pieces of things can be replicated, right? Those are the pieces, those are the gems, the economic transformational gems that we're looking for, because that's going to make all the difference when we don't have a lot of time in these communities around the country. So fast forward to today, nearly $2 billion we've helped leverage. I think the other statistic that I really want to lift up is, I mentioned to you that deep analysis that we did of coal communities and around the country. I'm proud to say that we've served 55% at the time of this presentation. So we're getting there, and we have really, really ambitious targets because we know we don't have the time for this to be a forever program. So this leads me to what I love to do, and the piece of the presentation that I have the most fun with is to do, as I was asked, to reflect a little bit on what we've learned. And I think, this is a very diverse audience. So I think as I was thinking about sort of some of the key lessons that I wanted to tee up, this is relevant for young scholars, this is relevant for those of you who are working on transition in other countries, and this is absolutely relevant for those of you who may be working, across the state line, right? So 6 lessons, I'm going to just tee them up, happy to talk more in the Q&A, but number 1, partial solutions don't work. This is why we feel like we need that framework of economic diversification, workforce, and infrastructure. We create an ecosystem of groups working on these issues to really make progress on this. Second point, there is no single silver bullet. If you're looking for one, you can stop. Don't waste your time. The answer for communities is to invest in a range of different sectors and approaches. You want to balance and diversify your portfolio. It's as simple as that. 3, really, really important, engage the next generation, right? There are solutions that are really befitting for the workers that are losing their jobs today, and that's important, but we're really thinking about the long-term health of these communities, right? So what are the sectors and the industries that are going to help young people stay where they are so they don't have to leave and places don't have to experience brain drain, right? So that next generation is really critical. And then, I'll say just a few more things, but I think the other thing I'd like to just emphasize in light of time is that what we've always found is that early action produces the best results. If you've got a coal plant closing and it's going to close next month, guess what? You're probably too late. You should have started thinking about it 2 years ago. And we do, right? That's where we've have the most success. And maybe I'll just end on one final note because I'm asked this question all the time, but I just want to remind us all, it's really early days, right? This work, as one of our grantees famously said, ensuring a just transition will be long, hard, and expensive. We are not going to see the type of economic transformational change that we want to see overnight. We can definitely see markers of progress, but we got to be in it for the long term. The last point I'll leave you with is just some specific takeaways for early career scholars, because I'm really excited to see a room full of people from different disciplines engaged in this work. The first thing I hope you've seen by thinking about what this work looks like during 3 different administrations is that there are a variety of entry points, right? So whether if you want to work on workforce development, if you want to work on fiscal policy, in Montana, if you want to work on capacity building, there is a space for you, right? So there's a lot of different ways to get engaged. Second point, maybe a plea, if you'll allow me. I would love to see more academics engaged because we really need more academic rigor in pursuit of economic goals, right? And what do I mean by that? So all the time, I'm thinking about the ways that we are constantly helping our grantees and the things that we are looking for experts to provide the answers they need. Skill set matching, right? That's a great opportunity for an academic to get involved. Helping local groups really identify and understand what are the most promising sectors, right? Market research. And then third, and this is what we struggle with a lot at the JTF, and I think it's one of the biggest takeaways I'd love to leave you with, is really rigorous research around looking at solutions that'll have the biggest magnitude on the economic impact. What are those solutions that are going to have the biggest impact locally to help that local community retain wealth? We talk to our community groups about that all the time, and they really struggle trying to figure out, we're not sure. Here are a range of options. Which one is the best, right? We really need help figuring that out, right? So a couple of things that I think as academics that you can do and think about. And then the fourth sort of takeaway that I would leave for all of you, and this I've just found incredibly helpful in the work at the JTF, is the importance of focusing on commonalities and generalize those principles, right? We can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. We cannot try to go down to this granular level and make a one-size-fits solution. But what we can do is we can focus on what unites us versus what divides us, right? And that's going to help us go farther together, right? So I think that's all I have for you. I know there's going to be an Act 4. I have no idea what it's going to look like. Happy to chat over a drink about that. But really just delighted to be here with you today, and thank you for letting me tell the story of the JTF, and look forward to more conversation.
Thank you so much. What a just totally spellbinding and perfect presentation. So I'd like to turn now to introducing Dr. Brian Anderson, who, as I mentioned, is the Executive Director of, I'm just going to call it the IWG. And that's a position he's held since April of 2021, and he does this from his role as senior personnel in the U.S. Department of Energy. From 2018 to 2023, Dr. Anderson was director of the National Energy Technology Lab of the Department of Energy, and in 2023, he transitioned to the Office of the Undersecretary for Infrastructure, which allows him to serve as a senior advisor on energy communities and direct the IWG. Dr. Anderson is a fellow academic. He holds a BS in chemical engineering from West Virginia University and an MS and PhD in chemical engineering from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He began his career at WVU in 2006 as an assistant professor in the Department of Chemical and Biomedical Engineering, and throughout his tenure at WVU, he became a recognized scientist and subject matter expert in natural gas hydrates, unconventional oil and gas development, and clean coal technologies. Dr. Anderson is the recipient of the 2012 President Early Career Award for Science and Engineers. For those of you that are not from the United States, you should know this is our nation's highest academic honor for early career scientists. And he's more recently the recipient of the Department of Energy Secretary's Honor Award for his work in response to the BP Deepwater oil spill, Horizon oil spill. So with no further ado, thank you so much, Brian, and we need to get your PowerPoint up.
There we go. Well, they say that imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, if anybody has heard that. And you saw a quote from me on one of Heidi's slides that says, everything we do in the IWG is based on what the JTF has built. And that's true. And so we absolutely are trying to imitate, but then figure out what the federal response is to the just transition. How in the world are we going to make sure that we achieve the climate goals that we need to achieve for the sake of our planet, but do it in a way that's not leaving communities behind? And so in the first week of this administration, there was an executive order, Executive Order 14008, and that is tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad. And in section 218 of that very important executive order for this president, section 218 said, but don't leave communities behind. And therefore, we're going to stand up the Interagency Working Group on Coal and Power Plant Communities and Economic Revitalization. I will henceforth call it the IWG to save my breath. But backing up a few years, when I was a faculty member at West Virginia, actually let me back up even further. I am from West Virginia. I am from a coal mining and oil and gas family. My father grew up at the mine mouth coal camp of Carbondale number 9. Picture, if you've ever seen those are international audience, there are some really iconic movies called Mate One, which not as many people have seen, and October Sky, which is the story of early stage astronauts after Sputnik, who were inspired from coal communities in southern West Virginia to find their way out of those coal communities. That coal camp is like where my father grew up. And I grew up in a small town. We moved out of the coal camps before I was born. But I grew up in another small town in rural America where the manufacturing sector started disappearing as I was a child. The manufacturing sector had a company named Norris Industries that used to make those brilliant, beautiful Oldsmobile hubcaps with all the chrome and wires that you never see anymore. There was another company that made every last exit, the inflatable exit ramp for airplanes. Back in the early 1980s, every single one in the country, actually every single one in the world, was built in Spencer, West Virginia at a place that B.F. Goodrich owned. Both of those companies left my little small town of 3,000 people, and the town's population went to 1,700. And so I saw it happen. My grandfather, on the other side of the family, also in 1957 was working at what then was the world's largest aluminum smelter that was built along the river, built in West Virginia because they had cheap energy, cheap electricity. The reduction of aluminum is one of the biggest draws of electricity. It was the largest consumer of AEP, American Electric Power's system, when it was built. I started working there when I was 16 years old. And its story of that power plant, or of that aluminum plant, also mirrors what happens with the connection between the energy system and the industry, is that in the early part of this century, the company was faced with trying to get a long-term power purchase agreement in the United States, or one in Iceland, based off of 100% renewable energy. And they were able to get a long-term power purchase agreement to build a new plant, expand a plant just outside of Reykjavik, Iceland, and subsequently the reduction facility at that plant that my grandfather built that I worked at when I was from 16 to 21, that plant shut down. And in a county where you have an economic anchor and close, you see all those three stacks that Heidi showed. You see the stack of direct and indirect job losses and the tax revenue. And 40%, and I need to see if there's some economists who have actually studied this, but 40% seems to be that magic number. Whenever there is an anchor facility or institution of employment and tax base, from Jackson County, West Virginia, where I grew up, 40% of the tax base of that county comes from that plant. In San Juan County, New Mexico, 40% of the tax base comes from San Juan Generating Station and associated work. Over and over again, you hear that 40% number, and I think it's when you build an economy locally, and you have a big anchor institution, that is a number that then the other 60% comes as the indirect jobs, the indirect parts of that economy locally. And so we see this all over. So back now, moving forward into when I was at West Virginia University, I had an opportunity to move to Switzerland in 2013, a dream job for an academic. The job offer from ETH, the Swiss Federal Technical Institute. If we have any folks here that know that it's the home to about 11 or 13 Nobel Prize winners, it's where Albert Einstein was trained. And I was about to leave the country. I was about to leave West Virginia and be part of that brain drain. But I had an opportunity then to go to the institution, go to WVU and say, let's create an energy institute. An energy institute not just to focus on the R&D that happens in engineering and in chemistry and physics laboratories in the energy space, but we have to find an answer and a solution to the changing energy environment in the state of West Virginia. And so that Energy Institute, we founded it with the goal of looking forward, looking through the windshield as opposed to the rear view mirror of where the economy based on energy needs to be. And so Heidi has beat me by a few years, like 1 or 2 years, in getting engaged directly in what the energy system looks like and how the economies that are built around it can transition. So in 2021, when the president, the executive order said don't leave communities behind, and a report is due in 90 days. We jumped at the chance at NETL, the National Lab, to say let's get our hands dirty, and so we built off of the great work of the JTF and other partners that were the NET framework to try to take that first step of what it looks like in the federal government. When you look at coal plant closures, coal plant and mine closures in red, plants in blue, again, it affects, like Heidi said, 10% of the United States, some in a much more drastic way, like the 40% number that we showed. So what we knew we needed to do was bring together the whole of the federal government, because luckily over nearly 250 years of red tape and institutionalization of the agencies across the US federal government, there are a lot of silos that are built between agencies. But if you look at a holistic approach of what happens when a community is about to be left behind or has been left behind, it's not just the Department of Energy, it's not just the Department of Agriculture and Rural Development, Department of Transportation and the transportation systems, Commerce and its Economic Development Agency Authority and broadband. And it's the Appalachian Regional Commission, it's education, it's labor. And so we brought together these 11 federal agencies and gave them a mandate. You have programs within all of your authorization and appropriations. And so for our non-US guests and for many US guests, to let you know, every agency has an authorizing committee within Congress that gives them the authority to spend money or to do work in a specific topic area. Then there's also an appropriations committee that puts the money into those programs so that you can do work or you can spend money in specific topical areas. And so when you scour all of the federal government, we identified about 39 billion, or 37, I've forgotten now over the last 3 years, $37 billion of authorized and appropriated funds across these 11 federal agencies that can be put to work in energy communities. And so that was a huge start. Now, it was how do we make sure that all of those programs are actually put to use, because the capacity in under-resourced, in needy, in undeveloped communities, the capacity isn't there as well. So how do we amplify that? So we spent the first year both designing a four-pillared approach and doing a lot of listening. So the four pillars were, one, first and foremost, stakeholder engagement, and we wanted to listen. We wanted to understand what communities need, what they're not getting from the federal government, what the federal government can do better. And I'll always remember this. On June 3rd of 2021, this was a little break after we had the first wave of vaccines, and we thought we were going to be open back up. On June 3rd, we had our first in-person stakeholder event, and at that event, Stephanie Tyree from the West Virginia Development Hub, Stephanie Tyree said, "We have been trying to innovate the way that economic development is done in communities for a long time. It's about time the federal government," Brian, I challenge you, is what she said, "Brian, I challenge you to innovate the way the federal government does business." And that has been our mantra ever since. So stakeholder engagement was one of our pillar investments, how we can line up not just those $39 billion, but within the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the Inflation Reduction Act, and CHIPS and Science Act, how we can line up investments to go into communities. So stakeholder engagement investments. The third pillar was policy. What policies are still needed? And you can see a lot of the parallels between what the JTF and Heidi just spoke about and what we were trying to drive. The third pillar was policy, and the fourth was integration. And we wanted to integrate how the federal government does business, the 11 agencies, how we can simplify the process and make the agencies work together. But also, the integration piece, we looked at it as a two-sided funnel. We have to integrate how the federal government does business, but then on the ground, help try to make sure that the state governments, the local governments, economic development agencies, and philanthropy can also work together and integrate on both sides of this. And when we listened and we heard that we needed upgraded infrastructure, we need economic development opportunities, workforce development, capacity building, housing, and environmental remediation. These should look familiar. Again, imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. And what can we do with the federal government? Well, we can reduce the match requirements. So we've been pushing on agencies to go to their statutory limit, and then when they reach the statutory limit, there's also often ways to waive cost share under certain circumstances, and really pushing agencies to do that where they have the power. Reducing administrative barriers. I'll say there's one program within the Department of Energy. It's one example of many, but we've been able to reduce what was originally a funding opportunity announcement that would result in a 30-page application plus about 15 pages of appendices and budget, way too much for what it was intended to do. It was intended to be a technical assistance program. Thank you for laughing. I'm not talking about the $10 billion hydrogen hubs. It's a technical assistance program, but we were able to reduce that type of application down to one that is I think we use a Microsoft form online that's 2 pages long. Because if you need technical assistance, I mean, why are we putting you through a 15-page application? And so we are trying to make those types of wins. And I tell you what, one of the things that makes me the most excited is when we bring our 11 federal agencies together in a room, and we do it every month at the agency lead level. We bring them all together. We do it weekly across the country, and something I'll mention, the rapid response teams, where all the agencies come together, and the level of commitment, the heart that people have, the understanding that these federal employees across all of these agencies have, that they can acknowledge that we're making it too hard for the people who need it, and we need to do better. That heart is really there. And it goes down to everything from simplifying grant applications, increasing opportunities that can address multiple needs. So that's how can we put all of those different lines of authorization and appropriation language and put them together. And so one thing that we were able to do across 11 agencies is identify within their authorized language how they can help energy communities within their authorized and appropriated language, and put it together in a memorandum and had them all sign it. Now, John Podesta, who's one of our co-chairs, John was the chief of staff for President Obama, one of the chief of staff for President Obama. John made the comment when we said, yes, we have 11 federal agency signatures on this MOU. He said, I can't even get 11 in the room. How do you get 11 to agree on something and sign it? And it's because, again, people, they see the need. We're also trying to build IWG capacity. It rains pretty hard, I can hear it. We're trying to make sure that we're building the tools that can help meet communities where they are. That's something that is really, really important. There is no one size fits all. We can't do this from Washington. We have to do it. I live in Morgantown, West Virginia. I don't live in Washington, as a caveat. And we have to be able to build the tools that can be used by each and every type of community where they're at. And so I'm really happy that Cindy Winland here is in the front as part of our IWG Navigator team, and really, really deep with knowledge of how to help and assist energy communities. And then our Navigator team is committed to answering the phone call when anybody calls from an energy community looking for an answer. Where across the vast federal government can we find the answer? And then we're also trying to build getting started guides and putting up resources, success stories to, again, create those best practices. How has it worked in some places and how can it be replicated? And then, of course, all the tax credit maps. So what we're talking about is hundreds of billions of dollars available. And I had a 45-minute interview with the New York Times a few months ago on with the reporter. Really great interview. But they took a couple sentences out of the 45 minutes. But one of the sentences, I'm actually really happy that this is where it went, although it was put in a negative light. But I was really happy that what I said was, we have hundreds of billions of dollars available, but the work's not done. Because my biggest fear, and here was the quote, my biggest fear is that communities that have been left behind historically will just be left behind again. So what we have to do is make sure that the capacity is there, that the federal government knows that we have to right size our programs when it comes to a 2-page application for technical assistance versus a 30-page funding opportunity announcement. And so we have to make sure that this opportunity doesn't pass. It's opportunities that cost the transportation infrastructure, the backbone to the economy. The Inflation Reduction Act has $250 billion of loan authority for repurposing energy assets, to take the existing energy assets, and to tell you what, we have about $100 billion of applications in process today. It's pretty significant that are coming through the system at the moment. Other highlights: $20 billion in the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, including the $500 million to the Appalachian Community Capital through the CDFI specifically for energy community programs, and then 48C tax credit for manufacturing, clean energy manufacturing, and industrial decarbonization. This is part of a very large policy framework that it really is, again, once in a generation, really the most cohesive industrial strategy since the New Deal, where we aren't just going to move forward in the energy transition and invest in the new clean energy technologies. We're going to make sure that we invest in energy communities so they're not left behind. And so $4 billion of $10 billion of these tax credits are specifically designed to make sure we're manufacturing clean energy products in energy communities. And then throughout the annual appropriations, we have programs that focus on workers and economic development, remediation, housing, and social services. But then again, we need to get closer to the community. We have lots of really good momentum, bipartisan support in Congress through the bipartisan infrastructure law, and the White House and federal agencies really putting their effort behind making sure that these opportunities can go to communities. But we still need to be much closer to the ground. And so we created a set of what we call rapid response teams. We piloted it in Wyoming. And so in Wyoming, we have, led by the EPA, the regional office out of Denver, a rapid response team that brings together not just the 11 federal agencies, but others that that also can have a contribution, particularly HUD, Housing and Urban Development, is one that was left off the original list in the executive order for the interagency, but we bring them to the table because it's important for affordable housing. But they meet every other week with county commissioners, with county officials, economic officials, members of the state government and the governor's office and the energy team. And the state of Wyoming has met us where we came and created a new office as well to work directly with the rapid response team so that we can go hand in hand throughout the Wyoming communities and make sure that we invest. Now, then we replicated it in the Four Corners region in the Southwest, Southern Illinois, Indiana, Western Kentucky, the Illinois coal basin that really spans those three states, Eastern Kentucky, here in Appalachian, well, we're not in Appalachian, Ohio anymore, but if you go a little bit east, as I came this morning, in Appalachian, Ohio, and across all of Pennsylvania with a focus on Western Pennsylvania, those rapid response teams are meeting every other week with the local officials to make sure they have access and know where opportunities are on the federal side. And so I'm going to start wrapping up so we can have some discussion, but setting the scene here in Ohio, Ohio's energy history, the non-metropolitan area or the metropolitan area, Wheeling, West Virginia, and Ohio was number 3 on the list of the energy communities hardest hit in terms of its fraction of the workforce that's involved in the energy system. And there have been over 10,000 jobs in coal generation as of 2022. This is coal power generation. But since 2021, there's been about $13 billion of investment from the federal side, lots of private sector investment, which really shows a light in something that happened that many of you may have missed in the macroeconomic space. Prior to the Inflation Reduction Act and incentives specifically placed to put tax credit bonuses on investing in energy communities, the preferential place for clean energy investment around the country was not in energy communities. There was about $3.5 billion per month spent in energy communities and about $4.5 billion spent in non-energy communities. After the Inflation Reduction Act, that flipped. The private sector now preferentially invest clean energy projects in energy communities. That's policy at work. That's exactly what we wanted to happen. So now, every month, there's about $5.5 billion invested in energy communities, more than in non-energy communities. There's also been widespread response across all of the other organizations that are at play here. Everything from the National Governors Association, the National Association of Counties, and the National Association of Counties partnered with the EDA on something called BREC, Building Resilient Economies in Coal Communities. And there are some great examples of different plans for energy communities in the cohorts across the country. Again, just very, very exciting. And then, one of the last things I want to mention, again, the federal government, I say we need to get closer to the community. We need to be able to reach much more into, and when I say the community, I'm talking about the people that live, not the geographic space, not the roads and buildings, but the people who live and work and go to school in local communities, to actually meet them, to spend time with them and build the capacity there. So one thing that was announced on Earth Day this past year, there's going to be more to come. I'll give you a little preview, more to come about this program. But on Earth Day, the president announced that part of the American Climate Corps, we're going to have a program where we're going to put AmeriCorps Vistas directly in the energy communities and the rapid response teams. We're going to put about 5 in each of the rapid response teams. We have seven already out there and 2 more planned. And those AmeriCorps Vistas will be able to work hand in hand with folks locally. And this is the way to move hybrid from the distance that the federal government often has to have to having real people who can pick up a pen and work next to you at the desk. So we're going to put AmeriCorps Vistas in communities all around the country to help focus on economic development, economic revitalization. And these volunteers can build capacity, they can help write grants, they can work on community benefits plans, which is, those of you who don't know what a community benefits plan, we designed this program with community benefits plans to make sure that when companies are investing in a community, they actually engage with the community. They help build the community centers. They work on creating childcare. They work hand in hand with the local government and the schools and the people to ensure that their investment doesn't just extract resources from the community, but helps build the community. And then the very last thing I am going to mention here, and then let's get into a discussion, is we were asked by Congress this past year to have a focus on the Three Rivers Corridor, the Monongahela, Allegheny, and Ohio rivers, all the way across Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, to the Mississippi, on how the rivers can be used to help, again, revitalize the economies across the region. And so we've kicked this off very recently and are starting, we're starting in upstream, we're starting in the Pennsylvania region and moving downstream. And there are some really exciting opportunities that we can find to leverage our waterways and diversify freight and diversify how we use our waterways for economic development. And so with that, there's a lot of success stories we'll probably get to around specific communities, but you can always get engaged and involved, and I'll put a plug in specifically. Here's our QR code if you want to find us at energycommunities.gov. But next week, we have a stakeholder convening. I know recognize a few faces who are going to be there in DC, where we want to plot out Act 4. We want to address what gaps are still left, where we're not reaching from the federal side, and we could, where there's policy gaps in making sure that we can effectively assist and make sure that communities aren't left behind. And next week, that stakeholder engagement gathering is all about looking forward and what's next. So with that, thank you very much, and I look forward to our discussion right now.
Right. And then is there another one for, there was
Just
two
have-
before.
But Lisa's the two.
Oh, just that one.
So look, this would be, but the other cameras can't.
Okay. Oh, you've got the other one. Oh, I didn't know that. Okay, great. I'll sit next to you.
So clearly we have this amazing expertise here, and we're excited to open up the field for questions, but we thought we might honor the executive privilege of the moderators here to start with a couple of questions. Do you want to start with a question?
Sure. So we have an amazing group of scholars out in the audience. We have a couple of amazing policymakers and practitioners on the stage. Heidi, you talked a little bit about how scholars can inform the process, but I'm hoping that each of you can say a little bit more about that. And specifically, you know, scholars are trained in their disciplines and their methods. They're not trained in how to identify policy-relevant research questions, unless they're doing policy school or whatever. And they're not trained in how to engage with policymakers once their research is done, to make sure that the relevant findings that they come up with are delivered in actionable forms to decision makers. So can you say a little bit about how folks might start doing that?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And whoever shut that light off, thank you. That was awful. Appreciate that. So yeah, I think that the first thing, and I mentioned this in the slides, and I don't think I dwelled too much on it, but I think it's going to be really important for you as scholars and academics to really create deep, authentic partnerships with the local groups that are doing the work. They understand, and I mean specifically community-based organizations that have an economic or a workforce bent, right? So could be a CDFI, could be somebody that has expertise in entrepreneurship, could be an organization that delivers critical worker training programs, right? Those are the specific types of groups that I'm thinking about. They are probably also going to have expertise and will know how to talk to policymakers, right? So, and they will know what they need, right? So I think really creating those authentic relationships is important, because you don't want to be, you know, on the outside kind of parachuting in. That never works, right? Oh yes, I'm sorry. Yeah, Community Development Financial Institution, right? So yeah, it's a CDFI. It's a group that usually provides low-interest loans to high-risk communities, in high-risk people in a community. So they are an important lender, and they're very critical in this transition space. So with that, I would say that some of the questions that I see, or some of the needs that I see most often that groups like that have, but that they aren't equipped to answer, you all are perfectly equipped to answer, right? Number one, and actually Ohio State University did some incredible work on this at the Voinovich School a number of years back, but working on skill set mismatch, right? What are the skill sets, what are the skills that your workers have, that your workers in need have, and what are the skills that employers need, right? And this is, I sort of alluded to this in the presentation, but this is where I think it's really important, where you got to be really clear about what problem you're trying to solve, right? Because it can be too easy to, not get granular enough about the specific type of worker, right? Plant workers have a very specific skill set that is very different from what I would say the workforce characteristics, or the worker characteristics of maybe community members writ large, right? So that skill set investigation and match, I think, is really critical. The second piece of information is helping these types of organizations really identify what types of sectors actually have promise, right? And I'll give you just an example, right? We work with a lot of organizations that are working to create jobs in X. And the first thing I say is, okay, so this is a really cool program. I like what you're trying to do. Where is your research that shows me that sector is actually growing so that people in your community can find jobs in that sector? And they say, well, we don't have it. Okay, well, you should have that, right? If you're going to go out and try to get funding for it, right? And again, that's another place where I think that the rigor of academics can really help. And the third piece that I would say is just urgently needed is, again, thinking about those economic solutions that are going to do the most to retain wealth locally, right? That is just really critical. Like when we're evaluating proposals at the JTF, I wish that we had the money to fund everybody in need, but we don't. So what we have to do is we kind of have to do triage. That's why we did that whole prioritization project, right? Number one, who's the most in need? Our money goes there first, right? And then the next thing we look at is what are the projects that are going to have the most transformational impact on that local economy? That's what we want to fund, number one, because it's going to make a difference. Number two, because it can be replicated elsewhere. And that question is just exceedingly difficult for those groups to really parcel out. And again, I think it's a perfect opportunity for academics to engage.
No, Heidi touched on quite a few that I would really amplify. And one, on the last piece, when it comes to what technologies, what economic impacts, I guess it was next to last, are really ready for investment. I can tell a little bit of a story. When I was still at West Virginia University, part of that economic development framework of, so it took a while to convince some folks in Charleston with the legislature or governor's office to look through the windshield instead of the rearview mirror. But once they did, it became a very concerted effort to try to identify what promising new technology, what promising new markets would be of an opportunity. And when you put together what the business case is for a new investment in a region, in a specific location, there are a lot of components. It's the workforce, it's the existing supply chains, it's the of course, the market need, demand, what are you displacing? All of those economic, micro and macroeconomic components. But then there's also another piece that I want to bring the social sciences in here as well, from the engineer, of course, right? Not every community wants every new opportunity. And part of it is because there's also an education component when it comes to what the risks, what the rewards, what the potential environmental positive or negative impacts might be to any new economic development in a region. And so being the honest broker to communities about new technologies is a really important role for academia. And you can see it, we're trying to do our best, the federal government, Department of Energy, of engaging with communities and listening to what concerns are. There's still sometimes a gap of fact-based information being provided locally to communities. Another component on the academic side that I think would be, it is a little bit of a mindset change. And again, this is coming from an engineer who studied thermodynamics and statistical mechanics in my research area. So take it with its grain of salt. But it's being a little more place-based in the research. And what I mean by place-based in the research, we talk in the federal government space, the National Economic Council Director, Lil Brander, talks very well about what it really means to have place-based economics and place-based investments in the federal side. When we look at a lot of academic work, it's too general, just frankly. But if you can focus on a place that has replication, has replicability, and real impact to a place that might be left behind, then I think it's very powerful. It can be used by local people. It can actually be picked up off the shelf and used in a very practical way when you've done a study on this community and this community's needs for investment and opportunities and what its workforce looks like and where it sits on the supply chain. You can think about if an economic developer can pick that up off the shelf and say, well, look, here's a study on this town that has these resources, it's much more impactful. So that'd be my plea.
Well, you're speaking to a room full of place-based researchers. Raise your hand if you're a place-based researcher. Yeah, okay, thank you, Brian, for saying that. So maybe just one quick question to set the stage, because I can already tell we're going to have some great questions from our international team here, is maybe just some reflection. Both of you have been in this a long time. You've thought about it a lot. What are the touchstones for you in terms of the portability of this story to other countries, or what you've learned from other countries and other regions that you take into your work?
So for me, we learn a lot from past transition. We learn a lot by looking at case studies around the world. So just thinking about the ones that are most relevant, I think a lot about what happened regarding the timber wars in the Pacific Northwest. I think about steel mill closures in the Rust Belt, right? Even the textile industry changes in the Southeast, and think about the German coal transition examples. There are, I think, there are probably more examples or more lessons in there of what not to do than what to do, because I think this stuff is really, really hard. And I think that, the work that we've both been doing over the last couple of years with the amazing people that finally have the resources to do it, I think we're learning more about how to do, place-based economic development better, right? But I think there's a principle in all that I would lift out to me that is like non-negotiable, transferable, critical for every single one of us, every single county around the globe that's working on this. And that's the principle of creating an export economy, right? So these economies have lost a major industry and a huge amount of wealth has left, right? What I see in our work sometimes at the JTF is that very well-meaning local organizations are almost treating their economy as like an island, and you could almost say that they are rearranging the deck chairs. They're not thinking about that principle of what can we export, whether it is knowledge, remote work, whether it's a manufactured good, a new battery manufacturing plant, right? Whether it's an experience, come here and you're going to experience the region's outdoor recreation, right? There are a number of examples like that. That creates the exports that is fundamental to a vigorous economy. So to me, bottom line, non-negotiable, that's what I would highlight, and that's what guides us at the JTF.
Well, that's great. And one thing I would add is, and Heidi had it up here as well, start early. And, I think that, that is, while it may seem like, a no-brainer principle, this is one that has bitten locations across the world. We look at some plant closures in South Africa when it comes to some early closures. when it comes to, certainly all across Europe. I know you're working in Australia, but one thing that is really transferable is when you have the plan and a timeline to be able to start the transition work. Thinking specifically to coal plant closures, just as an example to give you another case study. I'm big on kind of case studies. In Homer City, Pennsylvania, this is Indiana County, Pennsylvania. It was Pennsylvania's largest coal burning power plant. Think 3 gigawatt type power plant. And there were rumblings about its potential closure. But when it did announce its closure last year, the timeline was really short. And everyone was caught a little bit by surprise. And so now a year later, there's been a lot of effort, there's stuff happening. But that's one of the biggest challenges is when a closure happens quickly and it's a cornerstone of the economy, it's too late. If you're starting to work on it and the closure's going to happen in a month, it's way too late. And so, one of the strategies we've been working on, and a lot of countries have done this before us in a much better way than we have. But being able to create that timeline as part of the new source rules under EPA here in the United States, the proposed rules that are out there now, that those rules actually have good timelines for being able to meet the requirements for emissions, that then folks can start to work backward and know, if this plant is not going to meet emissions, now we have 12 years. Let's get started now with 12 years to go. Let's get started to understand what that asset can look like. And that's one thing that is absolutely replicable, is that you cannot replace planning, because if the time has come, it's too late. And so it's never too early to start planning. That's one.
So I think we're going to go to the audience now. Jeffrey, do you want to?
I see Fitsum has been it's been ready.
Oh, Fitsum. If you want to introduce yourself.
Thank you very much. My name is Fitsum Walda-Georges. I come from the University of Queensland in Australia. My question, Heidi, you earlier rightly mentioned that economic transformation takes time, a long time. It's a slow process. So how do you, as a JTF, help communities and economies that have heavily relied on coal mining for a long time? How do you help them reconcile this lengthy period of time needed to transform economies versus the pressure to phase out coal mining? Thank you.
I love that question, and that's great. And so, thank you for asking it. So I'll answer that with very specific examples of our work in West Virginia, Brian's home state, right? So, the short answer to your question is you've got these very long-term economic indicators that you're looking for, but it's going to take you at least 10 to 15 years before you start seeing that, right? So what do you see? What are the short-term interval markers of progress, right? And so for us, actually, if you think about these groups, and if you just think about like investment per se, philanthropy can help do a small bit, right? What the federal government can do to invest in these communities, it dwarfs what philanthropy can do, right? The private sector can dwarf them both, right? So there's a nice sequencing or trajectory. When I think about a community moving through different stages, you see them often being supported by philanthropy, testing their work, then they are going after federal grants, then they're going after larger federal grants, then they get private investment, right? So those are the markers of progress along the way, and I'll give you a great example from our work in West Virginia. When we started the JTF and we were working with a bunch of our Appalachian donor partners, we started supporting a couple of organizations that had never received a federal grant before, right? So Generation West Virginia was one of those groups. They worked very closely with two other organizations, the Hub, which is a group that Brian mentioned, Coalfield Development. Both of those groups were just starting to get federal funds, right? So for us, the first benchmark is access those federal funds, because it then helps you scale, right? So we help that one group get her first federal fund, build her capacity, and just in this last year, those 3 groups received a $63 million Build Back Better grant. And that one group that I mentioned that we helped get their first federal grant, we've just looked at the amount of broadband funding that they alone have leveraged, and it's nearing 50 million, right? So that is what builds the capacity. So is Southern West Virginia as an economy, are they where they need to be? No, but if you look at those critical indicators of the capacity of the local government, the capacity of some of the community-based organizations doing the work, that will tell you a lot to see if the community is progressing, right? And honestly, actually, that's another great area for more academic research, because as you asked me the question, I'm just thinking I know what I'm looking for and what I see as markers in the places that we work, but it would be really cool for somebody to do a study for me to say, maybe these are the markers that are in common. So.
Doctor.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I'm Ann Janad. I'm a researcher at the Urban Institute in Washington, D.C. And I just want to put a question to both of you. So the talk that I gave at this conference was around the Coal Communities Commitment Program. I did a deep dive using EDA administrative data to look at what types of projects were funded and where these projects happened. And when you look at the subset, like setting aside the Build Back Better awards, when you look at the Economic Adjustment Assistance Awards, so the majority of the awards that are project-based awards that went to 89 different grantees across the country, most of those are basic infrastructure awards. And when you look at who's getting those infrastructure awards, it's overwhelmingly your rural communities. It seems that, and when you look at even among those rural communities, your persistent poverty communities are overwhelmingly underrepresented among those CCC grantees. It seems that so much more is needed beyond just priority set-asides or different eligibility requirements that prioritize rural or reduce cost shares and such. I'm wondering what your thinking and the vision is here, because at Urban, we work a lot with different federal agencies, and everybody gets it. They know, especially for rural, this is a huge problem. I just can't help but think about the counterfactuals from all of these rural communities who they're not even close to a shovel-ready idea to bring to you yet. How are you thinking about this problem? Because it's distressing to think about just this giant N of these communities that aren't even anywhere close. So if you could just speak to that in your observations, thank you.
So one, thank you so much for highlighting that. And that goes back to my comment about my biggest fear is that we'll continue to leave communities behind. And so I think that I'll say this is another area for some academic research, and thank you for doing it, is to continue to hold us accountable, hold the federal government accountable, and then when it comes to how we can restructure the grant system, that's where we start running into those practical barriers. And so I'll get a little history. When I was running NETL, the National Energy Technology Lab, there's about $10 billion of federal funds that go through there a year that I had sign off on to ensure that those dollars were actually going to be spent well and we weren't going to waste taxpayer dollars. And so the reality of it, when a merit reviewer is reviewing an application, even if we make it simple or we lower the cost share barrier, there is a litmus test of, will these dollars get managed well? Will these dollars be spent well in the end? There's kind of the evaluation of the applicant to make sure that the dollars won't be wasted. So that brings us then, how do we solve that? For the first time federal grantee award. And so that's where I think the continued focus on building at the grass tops to make sure that we have institutions that are actually focused on the ground in the disadvantaged communities and build their capacity so that they can actually be, so that they can be managed and then trusted. And so the more we focus on building the local capacity at the grass tops and organizations like Heidi's and others that take it a step further up a level, that can be a consolidator. And I think one thing, going back to the Act Now Coalition, which Heidi was mentioning in West Virginia, got the $63 million Build Back Better Regional Challenge Award. They are on that process of climbing the ladder to then be trusted by more federal agencies with more dollars. So they've gone from the, they can get a $60,000 grant from a foundation to the $6 million grant to now the $63 million grant. We need to focus on having multiple layers and levels of investment from the federal side to make sure that we can bring the communities up from the, and I'm specifically talking about the grass tops, so it might not know what I mean there versus grassroots. Grassroots would be the people that show up and speak about the community. The grass tops might be the local leaders, the town managers, those folks who have a little bit of a leadership role in the community. And then when we build that capacity up and create more institutions that can help with that capacity, then I think we can start turning the lever on it, because there are real fiduciary responsibilities on the federal government side to make sure that the funds are managed well when they go out. So we need to tackle it from both sides.
So I love your question, and I think there's two questions in there. There's the question for what can and should philanthropy do about that, and what can and should the federal government do about it? And we both need to do something. And Brian has just spoken from the perspective of the federal government, so I'll take philanthropy. This is where I get really, really frustrated, because you're exactly right. There is still a ton of need out there. And, the reality is, like, in a lot of places in America, like, the person who is writing the grants is also driving the ambulance, right? That's not a joke. That's a real situation, right? So when, and you're not going to fix that problem overnight, right? So for me, just speaking at the JTF, it's really thinking about, like I mentioned earlier, it's thinking about how do you build that pipeline, and how do you take the next cohort, the next generation of the, the Build Back Better recipients, and build their capacities so that they can go after grants. And that's where, for us, we have our Coal Communities Get Ready Challenge, where what we do is we select 12 sites around the country. We work with the communities for a year, and those communities have to have they've got a really big transformational economic idea that they want to employ in their community, but they don't have the resources yet to figure it out. So we help them scale that project idea and then go after federal funding. But that's a year-long process. And you know what? This is a test for us. We might find it's actually going to take us 2 years. I don't know, right? This is the first time that we're just launching that program, so it's going to take longer. But this is where I get frustrated with philanthropy, because what you're really talking about is a fundamental disinvestment in rural. And if you look at what national philanthropy, how much they invest in rural America, it's like less than 5% of giving goes into rural areas. How on earth are we going to create more economic parity between rural and urban areas if this is what we have to fight against, when we know that those philanthropic dollars are going to help try these new ideas, right? So it is not surprised at your results. There's a lot more to do, and it's frustrating for philanthropy. I'll maybe just say one more quick thing, and then I'll turn it over to you. But this is the other thing where I'm actually also worried about where we are in time, because if you know anything about funders, you know that funders have a very short attention span. Very short, right? So what I'm worried about is if something happens and we don't see another Biden administration, I'm afraid that all the great attention that we've built up and all the wonderful work that Brian and his team have done on this work is going to go out the window, because philanthropy is going to say we have a whole bunch of other challenges to work on. Let me tell you, that is a real threat, right? And then we're back to where we started from, right? So anyway, it's going to be a slog, and you're right.
Something just occurred to me as you were talking, Heidi, on this one is, there are other layers of government as well. And one of the reasons we've been very strategic about trying to work with state governments, and again, Heidi showed, there are some state governments who've done a really good job in this space, but a lot of the infrastructure funding the vast majority of the infrastructure funding out of the bipartisan infrastructure law goes to states first and then the states disperse. And so we have some work to do, not just with the federal government and the philanthropy, but within the states as well, because we need to make sure that the states are supporting the rural communities. And I think that's a huge piece that we might miss. The broadband situation, the BEAD funding goes to the states, and exactly. And so all of these end up running through the states, and we have some that are doing a really good job, but some that aren't. So that came to mind. And I just want to put another nail on what Heidi was saying about 5% of the philanthropic giving goes to rural communities, and somebody might say, yeah, but if you do population density, no, it's still 5x if you do it per capita. So anyway, I just want to make sure that was said.
As Jeffrey is going to our next question, I'll just make one point that I think is relevant here, which is, the way that the federal government targets place-based policies also could probably use some refinement, right? If you look at the way energy communities are defined, I think the most recent version, San Francisco's in there, San Diego's in there, Chicago's in there. We have similar problems with the way Justice 40 communities are defined. And so these are things that scholars can also work on to try to more precisely target funds to where they're most needed.
Hi, I'm Nicole. I have a question on the Act 4 question, and that's for both of you. Because it seemed to me, maybe I missed something from Heidi's presentation, that there was, during the Trump administration, you were able to still do your work.
Make progress.
Yeah. So my question is, if and probably when Trump wins in this next election, is there going to be a break in the projects that you have? What do you expect?
Yeah.
What are the challenges? You mentioned probably new priorities, new threats that are coming, and maybe looking away from coal. What are the things that you see that might happen?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm glad you asked this because I'm kind of obsessed about this question. It's occupying way too much of family dinner time convo. So, but yeah, I'm sure it's pillow talk for many of us. But anyway, it's a couple things. I don't know. But what I'm thinking about right now is, for us, if you look at our Federal Access Center, because of this historic investment, it's 80-20, 70-30, meaning that 70 to 80% of our revenue or our investments are going to help communities that are ready to go after grants versus maybe 25 that's helping the pipeline get built, right? If we see a Trump administration, that gets flipped because federal dollars probably aren't going to go away. There's going to be different decision makers and whatnot, but it's probably going to be more like 75-25 in the other direction, right? I think Brian is exactly right about work with the states. And, we have throughout all our work since the inception of the JTF really thought about what policies need to happen at the state and federal level. And there's always that pendulum swing, right, when you have different changes in administration, depending on your focus. So we've been at this point where there's been a lot of opportunity at the federal level, but we're going to go back to we'll do more at the states to try to get these state transition funds, right? And, I could probably go on for 3 other things, but the other thing that I would say is I'm also thinking a lot about sort of NET 2.0 because what that group of amazing individuals did was articulate policies that were the first step of what's needed, and we saw so much of that with these amazing laws. But we need other things, and we need more, right? And I think now we have a better sense of what that is. And that national policy change, of course, takes time. So it would be a really good time to start that. So it's more of that capacity building, I think, with some other things sprinkled in.
And Heidi, thank you for those. And one thing I will point out, and this was a big win for the institutionalization of the IWG, in our view, is we've been appropriated the last 2 years. I mean, it was meager, $3 million and $5 million the last 2 years. But we've made our way through the budget process, and Republicans and Democrats voted for our budget, and we have a budget. So, we'll figure out FY25, but in theory, I still have a job, no matter who's in the White House, no matter what, because there is an identification of this is it's an issue that has long preceded any administration, any presidency. Coal mining, coal mining jobs started declining with automation in last century. If you go from 2000, 2002 to 2024, we've gone from 52% of our electricity being from coal to sub 25 in every year now. And so it's a transition that's happened for a long time, and I think a lot of people have realized that. So I'm maybe just the optimist that we're going to keep doing work. Yes, decision makers on individual programs within individual agencies can and will change, but the inherent issue is still there of investing in communities, and we've made a lot of progress over the past few years in a very nonpartisan way. And if you notice, I mentioned the first rapid response team we launched was in Wyoming, which in the last presidential election was second only to West Virginia in terms of which way they voted. We've done a lot of work in, it doesn't matter who anybody voted for. We're doing the work in those counties and those communities, and people on the ground have seen the fruits of it. And so I think that you keep doing good work, and it will supersede politics with a capital P, and policy with a lowercase p can still support communities.
Thank you. My name is Paola, and I have a question about one of the takeaways that you had from the Just Transition dialogues with the different organizations, which related to engaging with the youth. And coming from Europe, where my research is done, and it's a little bit further away, let's say, in the transition process. It's been trying for a few decades now. This is one of the key problems that they faced in a lot of these regions, namely that, similarly, coal was also in very rural communities, and even when there have been some relatively successful economic diversification projects in those regions, there's very little appetite for young people to live in those regions for all sorts of, soft factor locations, but as well their desire to have different type of jobs that are not necessarily the ones that are there. Some of these regions, they do have some older population there, and there will be jobs, for instance, for taking care of the elderly, but they have a lot of trouble attracting people to live there, to stay there. And especially considering here in the US, people have to invest a lot of money for their education, probably have debt. I wanted to hear a little bit what the perspectives of young people are. Do they want to stay, or are they also trying to migrate to more urban context? And what's the role of education, training, retraining, and facilitating that transition also intergenerationally in the Just Transition? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. And of course, you get all kinds of different opinions, right, in terms of what people want to do in any given location. But we see this problem in almost all of our communities. Almost all of our communities complain about the brain drain, young people leaving, young people not wanting to stay, right? And I think this goes back to something that we discussed earlier about the importance of, you want to make sure that you're planning for the community you want to have in 50 years, not just 2 years, right? So you really want to think long-term and engage in the next generation. And I think sometimes people aren't doing that enough. What I see is needed, and what's important is just, it's a couple of different factors, right? It's first doing the work of making a place attractive to stay and good to visit and return to, right? So that's a lot of like the downtown revitalization projects, right, that you see with maybe there's more like farmers markets and coffee shops and breweries, and it's the community has to do a good bit to promote that type of entrepreneurism to make a place attractive, right? But I think the community also has to take the second step, which I was talking about earlier with the export economy, and that's thinking about what types of jobs do we want to see here and what types of jobs are possible here. And if we don't want to lose our young people, which many of these places in America at least are, what are those jobs that we could create here that would entice them back? And so some of the most exciting programs, like we're working with this with an organization that's got a workforce development program where they are actually they have partnerships with both employers within West Virginia, but also with employers outside the country, like with a Salesforce, for example, and they provide technical skills training so that young people can come back, and they target toward the people that have left so that young people can come back and get those jobs, right? They're doing that work alongside with another group that's doing those downtown revitalization projects, right? So I think the simplest way to answer that is I think you've got to think about both of those things, right? It's like what types of jobs, what types of amenities does a location have? And you're not going to see people come back if you don't have both of those.
And I was going to give an example of a program called Ascend. It's in West Virginia. It's a specific program that, in an area where there was really good broadband opportunity, that incentivized people to stay, young people to stay, or even move into the region, and gave them things like recreation credits, for example. And this goes back to build on your strengths. So for the local place to own what you have and build those strengths up. So for West Virginia, it's things like whitewater rafting, or the really big bridge that Heidi showed in one of the images is the New River Gorge, some of the best whitewater rapids in the world. And this program, specifically designed to draw folks to the state, gave them recreation credits to go whitewater rafting and things like that when they moved and stayed, and even some housing assistance. And it specifically targeted and marketed remote workers, just as one example. But it started with the fundamental of, that's why I wanted to say, building off the strength of what that community can have, investing in the strengths, in this case, outdoor recreation and whitewater rafting and things. And then, again, what Heidi was saying, that export economy, then this particular instance was exporting the knowledge through broadband. So it takes that also fundamental investment in the basic infrastructure and making places attractive to live.
Oh, I was just going to say, but I do think it's a really intentional strategy, and I think that with all of the planning efforts that we see, we just always encourage people to really bring in youth and to think about that next generation. If you don't do that, it's pretty hard to have success in this area.
I just want to recognize that we have a series of events tonight involving community members, so my instinct would be that we should end on time. I'm looking at Jeffrey. So with that, I know there's many more questions that didn't get asked, and hopefully our guests will be able to stay with us for a little bit, but we do have an exciting evening program planned. So let's take this time to say thank you so much for being with us and for sharing your expertise. We're incredibly grateful, and for participating in this format. So with that, I think I'll close this session and invite everyone to give our speakers a round of grateful applause. Thank you.